Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Monday edition of Point of View, and a lot has been happening over the weekend. So next hour, we're going to spend some time, first of all, giving you some good news. We may not have herd immunity, but a good amount of evidence suggests we may be actually moving into what's called super immunity. That's our first article, and you can find that on our website. We'll look at some of the economic consequences of the lockdown, as well as what has happened during the pandemic. And I would have to say that common sense once again is breaking out all over the place. Barry Weiss was on with Bill Maher the other day, and of course we've quoted her before in terms of the issue of anti-Semitism and the rest, really expressing some comments that you weren't necessarily expecting to hear from a person who was the op-ed editor for the New York Times and oftentimes identifies herself as a liberal or progressive. Bill Maher himself later on was doing an interview in which he said, "I'm done with COVID." And interestingly enough, a Danish newspaper now has actually apologized to its readers because they said, we've too uncritically accepted everything the government has said and never really tried to push back or reevaluate some of the things. So lots of things in that regard. But of course, a lot of eyes right now on Ukraine, NATO jets flying in that direction, a frantic evacuation of the embassy in Ukraine. This is the second time in 6 months something like this has happened, so we'll get into that. And if we have time, we'll certainly talk about the fact that, if you haven't noticed, stock market has been dropping. And, of course, we also have posted a piece on what some have called the election law circus. So there will be quite a bit that we will have an opportunity to cover next hour. But I thought it would be appropriate to really get into, again, the structure of our government. We talked about this a little bit on Friday. My commentary there was entitled, "It's a Republic," because once you understand that we're a republic and the basis upon which it was founded, you understand that some of those arguments against the Electoral College, against the filibuster and all the rest don't make a great deal of sense. And I wanted to especially begin to highlight a book called "We the Fallen People, the Founders and the Future of American Democracy." We'll probably be spending a little bit of time talking about the Federalist Papers, and I might remind you that a booklet we published some time ago on a biblical view on the Federalist Papers is still available. I'm holding it up right now for those of you watching online, because it will help you understand some of the things that we will be talking about. The author of this book is Dr. Robert Tracy McKenzie, has his PhD from Vanderbilt University, holds the chair of faith and learning at Wheaton College, is a professor of history there. You might remember that name because we've interviewed him in the past on that book, The First Thanksgiving, What the Real Story Tells Us About Loving God and Learning from History. So, Dr. McKenzie, welcome back to Point of View.
Kerby, it's good to be back with you.
Let's, if we can, get right into one of the phrases oft repeated, and it is that America is great because it's good. Now, I've had a couple problems with it. Problem number one is that it is falsely attributed to someone, which actually he did not say, as you talk about early on in your book. But more than the issue of attestation, if you read the Federalist Papers, especially some of the things that I'd have to say that James Madison writes about in Federalist Paper 10, Federalist Paper number 51, he didn't necessarily assume that we were good people. It gets back to the title of your book. He assumed that we were fallen people. So go into that particular issue, because we hear so often that America is great because it's good. That's not really true, is it?
No, it's not, Kerby. I think we might almost invert that. I think that part of the genius of the framers of the Constitution was that they started from the standpoint that men and women were sort of naturally motivated by self-interest. They wouldn't have said necessarily that we were evil, that we were as bad as we could be. In fact, they would have said that human beings are capable of acts of great courage and compassion and other expressions of virtue. But our default is self-interest. And one of the ways they often expressed that was that we love power. And so you read the various framers at Philadelphia, and they're talking about the love of power. And when James Madison sits down to write Federalist 51, he says that the love of power is basically sown into the nature of man. It is sort of endemic in our population. So they have to take that into account. Washington would have said, unless we take human nature as we find it, as we put it,
yes,
our experiment is not going to succeed. And so the single best sentence in Federalist 51, which I love, is when Madison writes that if a majority be united by a common interest, the rights of the minority will be insecure. There's no ifs, ands, or buts. Anytime power is concentrated, it's a threat to liberty.
Well, and again, that's one of the reasons why we have this idea of separation of powers and balancing powers and all sorts of things, countervailing ambitions and the rest. But let's stay on that for just a minute, because, again, if you get your view of human nature correct, you're going to be more successful. And I know that when I was taking American political theory in graduate school, I began to understand, Dr. McKenzie, very quickly, that if I took a biblical view of human nature seriously, I could reject Plato's Republic, because you might not always have enlightened statesmen, as Madison said. I could certainly reject Karl Marx, the idea that somehow if we change the culture and the superstructure and the economy, we'll create a new man. And I'm pretty much left with some of the founders and some of those who preceded the founders, because they took human nature as it was, rather than trying to wish that human nature was different or posit or predict that someday it would be different. And that's one of the reasons why we've had such a successful Constitution, don't you think?
I certainly would agree, Kerby. The framers were anything but utopian. They basically start with the assumption that there is no framework of government that can eliminate all potential for injustice. But they do believe that there are ways to structure the government in a way that mitigates that potential, if never eliminates it. And you're right. The kinds of features of the Constitution that we all learn about in civics class in junior high, the separation of powers, the checks and balances, all of those flow out of an understanding of human nature. In fact, I would argue that almost every paragraph, every line of the Constitution, in some sense, is the framers' commentary on human nature. And that's, of course, that's what Madison said government was to begin with, the greatest of all reflections on human nature.
Well, again, I'm going to take a break, but maybe we'll spend just a few minutes on James Madison, because I love one of the comments you made there, that if he was in college, or could even say in high school, a career counselor would probably say, you need to go into some other line of work. I remember years ago when I was speaking on the issue of the Federalist Papers and James Madison, somebody raised their hand and said, we hear a lot about George Washington. Why don't we hear very much about James Madison? Well, there's some reasons. First of all, George Washington was like 6'2". James Madison was about 5'1", 5'2". He wasn't exactly the kind of person that would go into a crowd and meet people. Probably wouldn't have done very well politically, even though, of course, he served in the White House as well. And so I'd like to get a little more of his insight, because I think some of the training that he received from John Witherspoon at what today we would call Princeton University and the rest helps us understand that. And then let's get into this whole idea of human nature, checks and balances, and the rest, and then how that changes with this idea of kind of a Jacksonian view as well as our modern view. So we have a lot to cover. Dr. Robert Tracy McKenzie with us as we talk about his book, We the Fallen People. We'll be back with more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Earlier this month, a political commentator at CNN came to the realization that having COVID is not a moral failing. He declared that we unknowingly turned having COVID into some sort of judgment on your character. His remedy was for us to recognize that getting COVID isn't a moral failing. It's a super infectious disease that you can protect against but can't guarantee you won't get. That declaration was too much for columnist Charles Cook, who asked, unknowingly? We need to recognize? Societally? He then wondered if the commentator might actually live in a sensory deprivation tank. There is nothing unknowing about these previous claims. They are the foundation of the liberal progressive attack against other Americans. Anyone who had legitimate questions about the value of lockdowns and mandates was labeled a COVIDiot. The governor of Florida was described as Death Santis, while the governor of Texas was accused of belonging to a death cult. A prominent editor of the New York Times compared the southern states that, at the time, showed a seasonal surge of COVID to the slave-holding Confederacy. But as I explained in my September 10th commentary on COVID spin, there was no discernible pattern if you list the COVID death rate per 100,000 by state. If the politically charged comments on MSNBC, CNN, and the New York Times are to be believed, you would expect that red states would be at the top and blue states would be at the bottom. We will post the chart again so you can see that there is no discernible pattern. 4 months later, at least one commentator finally acknowledged the obvious. I suspect it is because the number of COVID cases have increased so much in blue states. Well, better late than never. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Conversation this hour on the book We, the Fallen People, the Founders and the Future of American Democracy, published by our good friends at InterVarsity Press. You probably will be able to find it in your local bookstore, but we have a link to it as well on our website. Might just mention that if you look down the list of people that have endorsed the book, almost all of them have been on the program. Thomas Kidd, John Fee, history professors, Ed Stetzer, John Wilsey's been on with us as we've talked about American exceptionalism, Mark Galley, former editor-in-chief of Christianity Today, and others that have endorsed this book. And again, it is a resource that I think would be very helpful to you at a time when we have so much misinformation about the Constitution, about its founding, and the rest. Obviously, a lot of people know about Hamilton. If nothing else, it's a Broadway play, but they knew quite a little about James Madison, even though he wrote 28 of the Federalist Papers. And for just a minute, Dr. McKenzie, how about giving us a little bit of a history lesson? If I went out right now with a microphone and asked somebody, what do you know about James Madison? First of all, a lot of them wouldn't know anything. If they gave me any answer, it'd probably, well, isn't he the guy married to Dolly Madison? And yet here is the individual that took the notes on the Constitution Convention. He and Alexander Hamilton wrote the preponderance of the Federalist Papers, and he is the person we're talking about in terms of understanding a biblical view of human nature. So what do we know about him?
Well, you've already anticipated. Generally, in the public, we don't know a great deal. But historians have often referred to Madison as the father of the Constitution, and that's actually a title that's pretty well deserved. He's the one that goes to the convention at Philadelphia in 1787 with a clear plan, a set of proposals that really becomes the basis for the discussion, the deliberations there at Philadelphia. As you already mentioned, he's the one that takes notes on the convention, and most of what we know about the convention comes through his note taking. Then he's really instrumental in promoting ratification of the Constitution. He's very instrumental in engineering the passage of the Bill of Rights. And it's really hard to identify a single other individual that equals his influence on the document and on its implementation.
Let's see if we can maybe see how near the end of your book you have a whole section on today, but we don't have to go all the way to today to recognize that Hamilton and Madison, of course, Washington and Franklin and all sorts of people were struggling how to put this together. And the first was, of course, this idea of a bicameral legislature, and one that where you would have the lower house, that would be the House of Representatives, be popularly elected, but the Senate would be based upon the states. And up until recently in terms of more than 100 years, they were actually selected by the legislature. And part of that was to have two different sets of eyes looking at legislation, and for the Senate to be the place where the hot tea would maybe cool in the saucer, if you will. So today, when we have so many people that are saying we need to get rid of the United States Senate, it needs to be popularly elected, we need to get rid of the Electoral College, some topics we even addressed last Friday, it seems to me that if you understand why the framers put this together, it comes back again to this view of human nature, doesn't it?
It's certainly flowing from that. There's no question about that, Kerby. I think the framers' understanding of the relation of human nature to the form of government, it's complicated. There are two things that they believe simultaneously. They did believe that the majority must ultimately rule. And so Madison in Federalist 63, I think, says that the deliberate nature of the majority in the long run must ultimately prevail. But while they believe that the majority must prevail, they also believe that the majority will not always favor just outcomes. And they hold those two things simultaneously in tension. So on the one hand, they're advocating majority rule. On the other hand, they're creating a system of government that slows down that process of government. Their assumption is often that the electorate will be guided by passion, by self-interest, and by creating these elements in the government that slows down the process of governance. They hoped that they would at least reduce the potential for injury resulting from a majority preferences. So yes, the Senate was part of that, appointed by state legislatures. The legislative branch was part of that. The Electoral College was part of that, creating this sort of elaborate system, actually, of buffering the executive from popular pressure. And so all of those things are only really make sense if we understand their understanding of human nature.
And again,
they actually, I was going to say really quickly, the Articles of Confederation that preceded the Constitution had not had a bicameral legislature, had not had multiple branches. And many of the framers came to believe that was the primary reason that it had so abysmally failed.
And again, I didn't mean to jump in because one of the things you say early on in the book is that you quote from Madison about ambition must be made to counteract ambition. And of course, the famous quote in Federalist Paper 51, if men were angels, well, we wouldn't need these precautions. So when people today, Tracy, talk about the idea that it takes so long to form a piece of legislation, to get a bill passed, that was intended because the checks and balances, the idea of separation of powers and the rest all grew out of a fear of what at least Madison referred to as factions. And at a tribalism world that we live in today, you can see that there was great wisdom, once again recognizing that maybe some of the passions might cool over time. Wisdom would come to the surface and discernment would come to the surface rather than kind of almost a vigilante kind of spirit that would rush a piece of legislation into existence and thus then make it more difficult to remove that piece of legislation later on.
You're right, Kerby. I mean, when Madison looked at the landscape in the 1780s, he was often thinking about the state governments. And there he felt that the state governments were often structured in such a way that the sort of impulses of the moment, the passions of the moment, often held sway. And so, again, it's a kind of complicated view. The framers thought that the government under the Articles was really impotent. It was too weak. They wanted to create a more energetic government, but they needed an energetic government that would not ultimately become a kind of Frankenstein's monster. So they curb the power of the government at the same time that they are attributing it to it greater powers than had existed heretofore.
So again, first section, governing a fallen people. I could camp out on that, but I want to get on to some of the other parts of your book, and that is part 2, The Great Reversal. Now that takes us to Andrew Jackson and a different kind of view of human nature. Can you maybe set that up for us, and we'll get into some of the details?
Sure. If you just sketch really broadly, what is the case certainly by the 1820s is that the view that had informed the framers of the Constitution is largely, not totally, but largely now absent from public life.
Yes.
And so you'll have politicians, journalists, other intellectuals, and so forth, attributing a kind of innate goodness to individuals. I call that the democratic gospel, the idea that we are good by nature. And also what I call the democratic faith, which is that majority outcomes are reliably morally defensible. And those become so ubiquitous that they're almost uncontested by the 1830s. It is an inversion of the understanding of just a half century earlier.
So again, it's this idea of virtue in the people. So when we come back from the break, I want to talk about that because it gets us into also some of the things that we've inherited today. And that is, well, we don't necessarily need all these checks and balances. We need to get rid of some of those. As a matter of fact, of course, modern world, you could say, we'll let unelected bureaucrats in the deep state decide. We'll allow a few politicians to have that opportunity. We'll get rid of all sorts of things that are inhibiting possible action, and we want to streamline it as much as possible. And so it will take us into some of those ideas. But we need to take a break. And if you find yourself saying, I'd like to know about this, I've heard about Jeffersonian democracy and Jacksonian democracy. I've heard about James Madison and all the rest. And I wonder if some of the debates that we are having now, oftentimes even in the last couple of weeks here in the United States Senate, certainly with the pundits and politicians about the nature of this government, if we would at least come back and understand what the framers intended and also understand that it really started with a generally biblical view of human nature, not completely, obviously, but this is, I think, why this book might be very significant in this debate. And again, it's titled, We the Fallen People, the Founders and the Future of American Democracy. If you would like to get a copy, we have information about this on our website at pointofview.net. Of course, if you'd like to know a little bit more about Dr. Robert Tracy McKenzie, we have that link there as well. And so we'll spend a little bit more time this hour focusing on these issues, and then we'll get back to all the issues that we need to deal with that are taking place in our world around us. Try to give you a biblical perspective on each of those. We'll be back right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/sign-up. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/sign-up. pointofview.net/sign-up. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Featuring the book this hour, We the Fallen People, the Founders and the Future of American Democracy. You know, as we look at what's in the 18th century, now we're going to be moving into the 19th century, you can see very quickly that some of the battles we're facing today in the 21st century go back to some of those issues. And a lot of it has to do with whether or not you have a proper view of human nature, you understand the structure of our government. And so, again, we're continuing our conversation today with Robert Tracy McKenzie. We have information about him and the book on our website, and let me encourage you to maybe get a copy of it in hardback or Kindle. It came out a couple of months ago. You may be able to find it in your local bookstore, but as always, we have a link there so you can obtain it as well. Okay, Andrew Jackson. Again, just like Madison, if I went out with a microphone right now and asked some people, they might say, well, isn't he the guy on the $20 bill? Some people might say, well, isn't he the one that got rid of the National Bank? Some people would say, what about the Trail of Tears and the Indian Wars and all the rest? But in addition to that, it's the question of the virtue of the people. On the one hand, you had some people arguing of the virtue of the people, and of course you had John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. Eventually you get to this idea that they're not a virtuous people but free. So how does this whole view that Madison and Hamilton and other founders have changed dramatically by about the 1820s?
Great question, Kerby. I don't go on in detail in the book to try to explain that transformation as much as just to underline it, to call our attention to it. And what we see, particularly in Jackson, he's not the only person triggering this transformation, but Jackson begins to adopt a language that assumes that the people are by nature virtuous and that their decision comes with a kind of moral imprimatur. He, in fact, calls the American electorate the highest authority known on earth. And he often uses that to justify his policies. One of the things that Jackson is beginning to do, which we sort of take for granted today, but he's really the first candidate to run against Washington. The framers had said that power is a threat to liberty wherever it is concentrated, so government could be oppressive. Madison would have said the majority could be oppressive. But Jackson sort of accepts half of that and rejects half of that. He actually is quite willing to concede that government can be oppressive, not counting himself, of course. But he speaks about the electorate as if it is innately virtuous. We think of Jackson as the first populist, major national populist figure in American history. And what that basically means is that he's framing issues in a way that always presents the people in a contest against someone who would subvert their liberties or threaten their well-being. And the people are always virtuous, and the threat is always malevolent. And Jackson is going to be the people's defender and their champion.
Well, again, just since I mentioned in passing, it's worth mentioning that you spend a fair amount of time, of course, talking about one of the dark chapters in American history. I mentioned the Trail of Tears, the Cherokee Nation, and the rest. And I think that's something that we should acknowledge because, on the one hand, sometimes I've seen secular revisionists that have taken all the Christian content out of our American history. But on the other side, sometimes you have almost, if you will, dare I use the phrase, Christian revisionists that never talk about the fact that in addition to, of course, the dark chapter of slavery, we also have the very dark chapter of the Indian Wars, of the Cherokee Nation, and all sorts of other aspects that came about during the time in which Andrew Jackson was president.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think the Indian removal policy of the period is one that we really have to look full in the face, and we have to in part because it was quite popular, even though there was political debate over it, and even though there were some outspoken critics of the policy. There's no question that the majority of Americans favor it, and I think probably unquestioned that the majority of American Christians favored the policy. So we have to acknowledge that this was, in some sense, an expression of the will of the people. So one of the things that I try to emphasize in the book is that we have to think of Native American removal as a democratic outcome. That jars our ears. We want to say, oh, no, that was a contradiction of democracy. That was clearly at odds with democracy. But then that's the language of democratic faith. That's the language that says the majority is always just. And I think the framers would have said that kind of outcome, which we would all today agree is morally abhorrent, is something that can be an expression of the will of the people. And what I challenge readers to do is to really think about the parable that Jesus tells about the two men who go into the temple to pray. And one says, Father, I thank you that I'm not like other individuals. And the other says, Lord, have mercy on me, a sinner. And so when we see things like Indian removal, I actually think what we need to call ourselves to is not to say, man, that was really bad, and I'm so glad that I wouldn't have done that in that circumstances, but instead to be open to the possibility that given the same circumstances, the same cultural context, the same upbringing, we would have been in the majority supporting the policy. And when that happens, it ought to lead us to a measure of both humility about ourselves and a little more intellectual charity about those that we're quick to condemn.
We have sometimes people call in and they say, well, we're a democracy. And I always go on and say, well, it's a republic. And they're kind of like, well, it's just a semantic thing. I said, no, it isn't. Because as you point out in one of your chapters, of course, we didn't have opinion polls 2 centuries ago, but it's pretty clear that if there were opinion polls, say in the 1830s, that most of individuals, male and female, probably would have supported this. Yes, you had a close vote in the House of Representatives in the Indian Removal Act, but that was more due to partisan politics. And so you really take on the idea that people want to try to say that the Indian removal was a contradiction of democracy. And what you make as a case, and I think it's a pretty strong case, is it actually was a natural outflow of that. If you want to say, well, that was back in the 19th century, okay, let's look at the Jim Crow laws. We've been hearing a lot about Jim Crow laws lately. I think sometimes misinterpreted and misstated, but nevertheless, you can go into most of the southern states in which you had all sorts of restrictions on African Americans voting and the rest, and I'm sure there was an overwhelming majority there that would have also supported that as well. So rather than saying that those were contradictions to democracy, it illustrates again why the framers made it really clear that they wanted a republic, because a republic would respect the minority views. And once you move away from any kind of moral stance or moral reflection, then it's just whatever 51% say is right. And we've seen how that's worked out in various aspects of history, not just in this country, but in other countries around the world, haven't we?
I think that's true, Kerby. I think, again, I keep using this word complicated. I think the framers' understanding was complex. James Madison said the best hope that we have for protecting the minority is hoping that majorities will never develop. He very famously in Federalist 10 hopes that the society would have so many different factions that it would be difficult for a single majority to develop. What's lacking by the 1830s is that kind of humility about our own fallenness and a willingness to uncritically accept whatever the majority agrees to as sort of intrinsically good. One of the figures that really has shaped my thinking is this French visitor to the United States during the 1830s, Alexis de Tocqueville.
Right.
And what Tocqueville is telling us is that democracy is morally indeterminate. It can lead to liberty. It can lead to tyranny. And the other thing that Tocqueville is telling us is that we always have it, meaning we the people, always have the capacity at any particular moment in time to be agents of oppression ourselves. He called that the tyranny of the majority.
Yes.
And basically Tocqueville would say there's no solution to that. It's a danger that we have to be ever alert to, ever vigilant against, lest we sort of embody what we would criticize at other times.
That's why you need a William Wilberforce, Martin Luther King Jr., many others. And that whole section, conversation with Alexis de Tocqueville, I cannot regard you as a virtuous people. But I thought after we take a break, we might come back and focus on what you called the hardest section of the book to write. And that is some of the lessons for today, because we are still in the midst of trying to deal with some of the questions that were raised in the 18th century, revisited in the 19th century, expounded in the 20th century. Now we find ourselves in the 21st century. So what does that mean for our world today? We have seen the danger of factions and riots and the rest, and we are indeed a fallen people. So how can we as believers think through some of those issues and recognize the importance of being the salt of the earth and the light of the world, to recognize that we should be the best examples of citizens in our culture, engage in civility, make moral arguments, but at the same time watch out for the dangers that the framers actually identified and warned us against. So let's take a break. We'll continue our conversation with Dr. Robert Tracy McKenzie, We the Fallen People, the Founders and Future of American Democracy. If the book is of interest to you, we have a link to our website at pointofview.net. We'll be right back.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Concluding some of our conversation today with Robert Tracy McKenzie, We the Fallen People, 5 parts to it, and we've mentioned parts of each one of those, but part 5 is remembering, reminding, and responding. You said it's one of the hardest sections to write. Of course, a lot of that came during the pandemic, but if we can, Tracy, for just a few minutes, talk about maybe a few of the lessons we can learn from the founders in the 18th century, as well as some of the changes that began to develop in the 19th century, because these are still relevant today. If de Tocqueville had come to the 21st century with the same kind of mindset, I think he would see some real concerns that he sees developing and unfolding today. So how should we as Christians think about some of the things that have unfolded over even the first part of this 21st century?
This is the most important question we can wrestle with, Kerby, and I'm thankful for the opportunity to address it. I think for Christians who are involved, participate in our experiment in self-government, that the first step, I believe this sincerely, begins with acknowledging our own fallenness. Not just, it's going to be very easy for us to look around and say, well, those folks are fallen, but we start with a sense of our own fallenness. To quote Solzhenitsyn, we have to believe that line between good and evil runs within our own hearts, as well as within the heart of every human being. So what that means in our interaction with the public square is we have to constantly be reminding ourselves that there is no movement, no party, no leader who has escaped the effects of the fall. So it's not supposed to lead us to kind of paralysis where we say, well, all our options are sort of equally corrupt or imperfect. But we never going to see political issues as absolute evil versus absolute good, or absolute light versus absolute darkness. And so I think when we look at the way we interact, and I just mean Americans now generally, we see a political culture that is just eaten up with this sort of absolutist kinds of thinking. And I think at the heart of it is the idea that I am righteous and my group is righteous and that other group is evil. It's a very un-Christian understanding, but it's pervasive. And I actually think that worsens, it really does worsen our dysfunctional politics right now. It makes it almost impossible to engage in compromise politically because compromise with evil is evil. And so we don't want to see that happen. It sort of exacerbates the view of every election as a kind of existential crisis. If the other side is wholly evil, if they are enemies, not just opponents, then electoral defeat is really unthinkable. The implications are just too terrible for us to contemplate. And there's the old proverb that says, necessity knows no law. When we convince ourselves that loss in this election means the end of the United States as we know it, it really sort of lowers our inhibitions to various kinds of really concentrations of power on our behalf. Which sort of leads me to the third point that I make in the book, which is that in an ironic way, the more our view of human nature generally is positive, or at least that we think we are righteous, the more we're actually susceptible to authoritarianism. Because if we take seriously original sin, we don't want to see the concentration of power anywhere. We believe with the framers that any powerful leader is a dangerous leader, or we agree with Lord Acton that great men, meaning powerful men, have almost always been bad men because power corrupts. So when we start with the idea that I'm actually pretty good, we can convince ourselves that those who agree with us are also pretty good. And if only we had the power, everything would be okay. And that is a dangerous line to cross.
And again, that's that tribalism that we've talked about with Jonathan Haidt, one of the co-authors of the Coddling of the American Mind, that you aren't just in error, you aren't just wrong, but you are evil. And I think it brings us back to some of the things we talk about here in terms of humility, because Philippians 2, verse 3, do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit, but with humility of mind, let each of you regard one another as more important than himself. When I go into a conversation, I recognize that even if I may disagree with an individual, I want to listen to that individual because they may suggest something I've never thought of. They may actually change my mind. And if we go into it with anger, of course, Proverbs talks about the fact that a gentle answer turns away wrath. I've tried to be fairly gentle in the way I've interacted with, for example, individuals on secular college campuses. Hasn't always worked, but nevertheless, we give it the try. But it seems to me that comes from a sense of humility, a sense of self-reflection, and understanding that it's a debate that needs to take place because both sides truly believe that they are right. but if we can create some honest, caring dialogue and civility and graciousness, I think that's going to be very helpful. And it's just one more, if you will, very significant principle out of this book, We the Fallen People. So I wanted individuals to know about the book. It came out this fall. And just before we go, let me just mention that we also have a link to the Faith in History website that has some great material there as well. And if people would like to know more about you, what can they find when they land at Faith and American History at WordPress.com? We have all the link there as well. What will they find when they land there?
So they'll find about 300 essays or so where I've tried to think about various episodes in American history from an overtly Christian perspective. And you can read those essays. They all pretty much stand alone, so you can just browse the table of contents and read, follow where your own interests lie. And I would just also mention I have another website now that's roberttracymckenzie.com, which is really devoted in particular to the arguments of We the Fallen People.
Okay, well, we'll try to put that one up there as well. Let me just mention real quickly that I just enjoyed the conversation of the first Thanksgiving, what the real story tells about loving God and learning from history. And some of your blog posts were very arresting as well. For example, how the Pilgrim story might challenge and convict us and a variety of others. So whether you're talking about the Thanksgiving, whether you're talking about the founding of this country, there are a lot of lessons to learn from history. I'm not one of those to always believe that the only thing we learn from history is that we haven't learned from history. Maybe there is some value in studying these historical ideas. And if somebody would like to study under you at Wheaton, I know we have links there as well. So, Tracy, it's always great to have you on the program. I appreciate you writing the book and appreciate you giving us an hour today here on Point of View.
Well, Kerby, it was my absolute pleasure, and may God bless your ministry.
Well, again, look forward. Maybe next time I'm in Wheaton, I'll come up and shake your hand, and looking forward to that. We come back from the break. Okay, let's get into the news. Super immunity. What about that? We've always talked about other kinds of herd immunity, but is there the possibility of super immunity? Well, that's actually a positive note, but we also recognize as we look back, some people have done some really good evaluation of the economic consequences of the lockdowns. As I mentioned before, Barry Weiss, Bill Maher, people that wouldn't agree with much of what we talk about around this table are saying the kinds of things we've been saying for months. So I think common sense breaking out all over the place. And before the hour's over, we will talk about Ukraine. We'll talk about what is taking place there, the frantic evacuation of a U.S. embassy. This is the second time in 6 months in which that's taken place. Stock market dropping, all sorts of other issues that we will try to address. And so if you would like to join us in this next hour, of course, the number is 1-800-351-1212. If you'd like to listen to this again, click on that red button there on the website to watch or to listen to it. And, of course, we have some fact sheets. We have my Viewpoints commentary, which we'll get into, and all sorts of other resources. They exist for you. They're free of charge, but, of course, if you want to click on that button that says donate, we would certainly welcome a donation as well. And if you've learned something today, if you learned something over the next hour or so, maybe you'd consider supporting this ministry. Let's take a break. We have a lot more to cover, and we will do that right after these messages.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. the Point of View radio talk show. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View radio talk show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, we're going to spend some time getting back into the news. We'll talk first about the whole issue of COVID and the pandemic and the vaccines, a number of other things, especially some remarkable things being said by individuals who identify themselves as liberal, progressive, or atheist, or whatever. Depends on which individual I'm talking about. And all of them, interestingly enough, are saying some of the things we've been saying around this table for some time. So intriguing, to put it mildly. Then we'll get into, of course, the issue of Ukraine. NATO jets are heading in that direction. We have spent a fair amount of money. Have posted a very good article that does raise, I think, some significant questions by Michael McKenna, who actually writing in the Washington Times is an individual that most recently was a deputy assistant to the president and deputy director of the Office of Legislative Affairs in the White House, and raises a good question. Why are we rushing to defend Ukraine? Then we'll give you some other perspectives from individuals that say we have no really good options and all sorts of other aspects. And of course, the stock market has dropped significantly over the last week due to a number of things, not the least of which is the Federal Reserve deciding to maybe taper its purchasing of treasuries, which always puts the stock market into a panic. That's called taper tantrums, as well as a question about whether or not we're going to war with Ukraine and a variety of other issues. And then last article there, if we have some time, the election law circus, because it's worth backing up a little bit. Since last week, we went through this idea of we need to get rid of the filibuster so we can push through two pieces of legislation, I think, which at their face are unconstitutional, really would not stand the test before the Supreme Court, but we're going to force people to vote on it anyway. And the writer reminds us that these were sort of message bills. Those are ones that are saying, well, this is what we stand for, but we know it's not going to pass. So we'll run through some very liberal, even radical ideas, knowing that they won't make their way through the United States Senate. And then all of a sudden, people in the Senate acting like, yes, we really can do this, really need to do this. Otherwise, we have Jim Crow 2.0 and all the rest of the rhetoric that you've heard. So we'll try to cover all of that in the hour. But if you'd like to join us, that number is 1-800-351-1212. First article we've posted, and I would encourage you maybe to think about printing it out. Alicia Finley does a good job of explaining that we've been hearing people talking about herd immunity, and yet there is pretty good evidence to suggest that that doesn't seem to be likely, because as she points out, the COVID-19 vaccines, or even having a prior infection, thus whether you have vaccine immunity or natural immunity, doesn't seem to provide long-lasting protection against infection and transmission, especially when we talk about what's going on right now with the Omicron variant. But then she goes on to say, but don't despair. There's pretty good evidence now that Omicron will give much of the population what scientists call super immunity. That is a stronger protection against new variants, even future coronaviruses. Now, if you'll permit me for just a minute, I know you didn't expect to listen to a Biology 101 class, but if you would allow me to do this, I'll explain why we believe that superimmunity is a real possibility. And that is, we have two different kinds of white blood cells that are the front line defense against a disease. T cells and B cells. And these are individuals that are out there, in a sense, helping us get rid of all the diseases we come into contact with. T cells, she says, act as sentinels that circulate in our lymph nodes in our bloodstream. And then the B cells are actually kind of more like the immune force multipliers and actually proliferate and secrete antibodies to actually kill off those diseases. And so the T cells, once you've had a disease, you've had the cold, you've had a flu, you've had, in this case, COVID-19, they then reside in your bone marrow, a little bit, some in your lymph nodes and other tissues, and they're ready to mobilize again when you come into contact with something that is either the same or very similar. Meantime, you have these B cells. They actually are in the lymph nodes, but they're actually developing, and in some respects, she refers to them as almost like boot camp, in which they get into better shape to fight off the invader, whatever that might be, a different variant of coronavirus or whatever it might be, and thus actually create these antibodies that, if you will, can actually block new variants. And that's why some people have said maybe Omicron has been a real blessing. Now, you might say, okay, great theory. Do we have any evidence of it? I'll just give you two before we take a break. One study, which was done last month and released by the Oregon Health and Science University, found that vaccinated people who experienced breakthrough infections produced higher level of antibodies that were 1,000% more effective than those that were generated 2 weeks after the second dose of the Pfizer vaccine. So that's what the researchers there called super immunity. Pretty amazing. And so, again, it comes from what you might call a breakthrough infection. You might say, okay, that was in this country. Do you have in some others? Again, in the interest of time, I'll just mention one other, but you can read the entire article. Another study was done last month in South Africa. Remember, that's where we first identified Omicron, found that people who were infected with Omicron produced antibodies that were more than 4 times better at neutralizing the Delta variant. And so booster vaccines, although they help improve the immune response by giving these B cells more time to mature, that's why some people have said that may be why you've seen a few situations in which people that have had 3 Pfizer shots, the first 2 and then the booster, might have been able to neutralize it. But by and large, it looks like, again, that we may be not so much talking in the future about herd immunity. We might be talking about super immunity. And so that's that first article. You can read it, and it goes into a lot more detail than I'm going into, but I just wanted you to know that it's a way in which maybe we can see some positives, which I think you need to keep on the back of your mind when we start realizing the amount of pushback that has come from individuals that are convinced that if anything, we should actually put people in jail that haven't gotten their vaccine, haven't gotten their boosters, whatever. I'll give those statistics in just a minute, which are pretty unbelievable. But when we come back from the break, let me first of all talk about our second article, because there have been some people, in a sense, documenting what we've already known. What has been the economic impact of these lockdowns, and people that have been able to measure this with a lot more specificity than anyone else have concluded, for example, that 80% of the damage that has come during these pandemics and lockdowns came from the prevention efforts that hindered economic activity, and only about 20% from the direct effects of the disease itself. Of course, if you're one of the people that lost your life, or you know someone that has, you can understand that. But the point is that the economic impact, as we suspected, has been devastating and continues to be very severe in some of the places where these lockdowns still pretty much exist. So we'll come back and talk about that briefly. It's a very good piece, and it quotes from a couple of different research studies that I thought you need to know about. Then we'll talk about what some of the talking head shows were talking about over the weekend. Pretty amazing, some of the things that people have been saying. You've heard it here. It's just surprising to hear those people say the same thing we've been saying. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Earlier this month, a political commentator at CNN came to the realization that having COVID is not a moral failing. He declared that we unknowingly turned having COVID into some sort of judgment on your character. His remedy was for us to recognize that getting COVID isn't a moral failing. It's a super infectious disease that you can protect against but can't guarantee you won't get. That declaration was too much for columnist Charles Cook, who asked, unknowingly? We need to recognize? Societally? He then wondered if the commentator might actually live in a sensory deprivation tank. There is nothing unknowing about these previous claims. They are the foundation of the liberal progressive attack against other Americans. Anyone who had legitimate questions about the value of lockdowns and mandates was labeled a COVIDiot. The governor of Florida was described as Death Santis, while the governor of Texas was accused of belonging to a death cult. A prominent editor of the New York Times compared the southern states that, at the time, showed a seasonal surge of COVID to the slave-holding Confederacy. But as I explained in my September 10th commentary on COVID spin, there was no discernible pattern if you list the COVID death rate per 100,000 by state. If the politically charged comments on MSNBC, CNN, and the New York Times are to be believed, you would expect that red states would be at the top and blue states would be at the bottom. We will post the chart again so you can see that there is no discernible pattern. 4 months later, at least one commentator finally acknowledged the obvious. I suspect it is because the number of COVID cases have increased so much in blue states. Well, better late than never. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, what was the cost of the lockdowns? Well, we suspected it was very great. But again, if you want to have some more facts and figures and information that you can use, maybe in a letter to the editor, maybe you want to ask your member of Congress if they're aware of what happens when we do these lockdowns. The economic consequences are very well documented in our second article. It's written by Thomas Phillipson. You might say, okay, who is he? Well, he's an economist at the University of Chicago. He also was a member of the Council on Economic Advisors for many years and actually was the acting chairman for 2 of those years. So pretty smart individual, an individual as a professor at the University of Chicago. He goes in and talks about the fact that we didn't know what we didn't know 2 years ago, but we know what we know now. And whether we want to continue this, we should begin to evaluate cost and benefit. He says reducing the incidence of disease isn't necessarily desirable if excessive prevention in the form of lockdowns or school closures is more costly to society than the damage done by the illness. We don't close highways to minimize accidental deaths despite the existence of dangerous drivers, yet this is exactly what we were doing when indeed the government interveners chose to limit the spread of communicable disease by mandating vaccines that don't prevent transmission, of course, closing down various schools and economic activity. So you can go through all of the coulda, shoulda, woulda. That's in the past. We know a lot more than we knew back then, and here is the point. He says early on that the public health community has proven incapable of quantitatively assessing trade-offs between the harms of prevention and the harms of disease. If indeed you're going to, as he would say, believe that if an epidemiologist says that this is dangerous and that's reason enough to close down and not consider the ancillary impact, which we've talked about, increase in suicide, anxiety, depression, loneliness, drug abuse, the issue of not being able to identify various aspects of abuse, and on and on. We've made the list. You've heard it before. You've probably made your own list. He then goes through and reminds us of some of the studies that have been done. University of Chicago economist estimated, the number I just gave you a minute ago, that about 80% of the total damage from COVID came from prevention efforts that hindered economic activity, only about 20% from the direct effects of the disease itself. And one of his colleagues, who we've quoted on this program before, Casey Mulligan, has found that the total monthly COVID-related harms actually fell from 2022 to 2021, even as the number of deaths rose, and gets into some of the issues of taxes and the rest. Then, of course, he points out that one of the things that was done during that election of 2020 is candidate Joe Biden accused President Donald Trump during the campaign of getting Americans killed by refusing to clamp down completely on all economic activity, but the evidence shows that the United States experienced lower total harm than did nations of the European Union. By the way, I suspect that if you dig into the data, you'll also see something we've talked about before. Those particular states that had less of a draconian lockdown also probably had less economic impacts. And of course, we've heard some of that before. So it is the second article that I wanted you to be aware of because it gives some of those facts and figures. We've had this intuitive notion. We've had the anecdotes. We've had the stories. But now you have some of the numbers which illustrate exactly what we suspected in the first place. But moving on, let me just mention that this weekend, I was shocked. And I'm getting more and more shocked that if you had told me 2 years ago that I'd be quoting from Bill Maher and Barry Weiss on a regular basis, I would think that you probably had lost some kind of perspective, because Bill Maher is an atheist, calls himself a liberal. Barry Weiss, a very delightful individual, by the way. I have her book on anti-Semitism. Remember, I quoted her last week when we had the attack on the synagogue. But again, she was the opinion page editor for the New York Times, calls herself a liberal progressive. Well, anyway, she was on HBO's Real Time with Bill Maher, and she actually at one point just kind of takes off and says that she is convinced that some of these extreme measures, and she was talking about school closures, mask mandates, and the rest, will be remembered as a catastrophic moral crime. Pretty strong words from an individual that certainly would have probably gone along with everything. Matter of fact, she preceded that by talking about how she would just scrub down everything, spray Lysol and everything. She would take off her clothes for fear that the clothes she might have picked up, even as she's walking in New York City, might have the COVID virus. So she's going through all the things she did. So she was obviously a true believer. But then we get to her quotes, and I'll just quote from her. She said, "We were told to get the vaccine. You get the vaccine, you get back to normal. And we haven't gotten back to normal," she says. "It's ridiculous at this point." She goes on to say, "I know that so many of my liberal and progressive friends are with me on this, but they do not want to say it out loud because they're scared of being called anti-vax or being called science denial, or maybe even be smeared as a Trumper." So the point she's making is a lot of my fellow liberal and progressive friends think this is all crazy too, but they're afraid to say anything because they just don't want the cancel culture to come crashing down on their head. That's me giving you a little bit of an analysis, but let's go back to her direct quote. She says, quote, "I'm sorry if you believe the science, because if you look at the data that we did not have 2 years ago, you will find out that cloth masks do not do anything. You will realize that you can show your vaccine passport at a restaurant and still be asymptomatic and carrying Omicron. And you will realize, most importantly, that this is going to be remembered by the younger generation as a catastrophic moral crime. One last one. She says, people are killing themselves. They are anxious. They are depressed. They are lonely. That is why we need to end it more than any inconvenience that has been to the rest of us. I think it's like, at this point, it's a pandemic, a bureaucracy. It's a pandemic of the bureaucracy. It's not even real anymore. And so 3 cheers for Barry Weiss to say what I think a lot of people were thinking. She had the courage, at least on Bill Maher, to say that as well. Well, Bill Maher was not to be outdone, because then he gave a very candid interview to a publication which actually follows the entertainment industry called Deadline. And so in the midst of the interview, he kind of takes off and he says, I'm over with COVID. Well, of course, the interviewer has the obligatory, really? To which she said, yes, really. I've never been scared of it. I've always been scared of the reaction to it. And this has played out. It's only proved out to be more true for me. I'm sure many people feel different, but that's me. It was never that virulent a threat, I thought, to people who were in good health. Now, some people who can't help that, they're not in good health. We should, of course, protect the vulnerable, but it was mostly disease of the very old, which every disease is a threat to, and people who have comorbidities, which mostly is due to lifestyle. Don't agree with everything he said, but the point is now you have Bill Maher speaking out on these issues. And Chris, I've noticed that Whoopi Goldberg and a number of others have come crashing down on him once again for daring to make some of those kinds of statements. But I thought it was interesting that the largest newspaper in Denmark, interestingly enough, said for almost 2 years, we, the press and the population, have been almost hypnotically preoccupied with the authorities' daily, and she uses a word that wouldn't make sense to you, but basically the daily statements. Then, this comes from one of the journalists, the constant mental alertness has worn out all of us tremendously. That is why we, the press, must take stock of our own efforts that we have failed. We have not been vigilant enough at the Garden Gate when the authorities were required to answer what it actually meant that people are hospitalized with corona, and not because of corona, because it makes a difference. You know, we've had that conversation before. Did you die because of coronavirus, or did you die with coronavirus? Obviously a difference. The big difference, they say, exactly the official hospitalization numbers have been shown to be 27% higher than the actual figure for how many there were in the hospital simply because they have corona. And they go on and on and on. But this is the major newspaper, is the largest newspaper in Denmark. And so it's important to remember this because we've just had some reports that have come out from Rasmussen and Heartland Institute poll, in which they found that if they ask people, do you think people that do not get the vaccine should be fined, 55% of Democrats said yes, 19% of Republicans. Do you think some of these individuals should be imprisoned for public criticism of the vaccines? Almost a majority, 48% of Democrats said that, 14% of Republicans. And then they talked about, should we implement house arrest? 59% of Democrats said yes, 17% of Democrats. So you're seeing right now that as much as people said we didn't want to politicize this, it's become as political as you can possibly imagine, and this recent poll is a great illustration of it. We'll be right back.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/sign-up. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, if you'd like to join the conversation, love to hear from you. We're going to now talk about Ukraine. Do you think we need to send military troops there? Do we need to send munitions? What is our national interest in Ukraine? We're going to talk about that. Leads to our third article. But if you'd like to join us, that number is 1-800-351-1212. Just as a program note, let me just give you an understanding of what we'll be talking about tomorrow. We're going to have our good friend Jim Dennison on. He has his new book coming out tomorrow, The Coming Tsunami, and we'll be talking about that with him for an hour. I think you will really appreciate that conversation. Then in the second hour, we have David Curry with us, and we'll be talking about the World Watch and what are the most significant countries where there has been such a persecution of Christians and other religious minorities. Afghanistan tops that list, no surprise there. And then we'll spend a little bit of time also talking with Dave Sterrett, Jesus Conversations, and I think that'll be helpful to you in terms of how do you witness to your friends. So again, covering lots of different topics over the next 2 hours on Tuesday. On Thursday, just as a program note, let me mention that we'll have Chelsea Ullman with us. We'll talk about the March for Life, which took place last week. We'll look at the prospects for the issue of life and the issue of abortion with her as well. The Supreme Court decided not to decide on the Texas case, and we'll talk about what that means. What is the future for the particular case out of Mississippi that could be used to overturn Roe versus Wade? So we'll be talking with her. And, of course, we have our Friday weekend edition. And boy, do we have a lot there. Kelly Shackelford will be with us. Penedexter will be with us. Matter of fact, I just happened to see Kelly as I walked by him doing another interview in front of a camera because they've now extended their defense, not only of the Navy SEALs, but all those in the military. So we'll talk about that. Of course, we have a case now going to the Supreme Court, which we've been wanting to take place on Coach Kennedy. So lots to cover. And all of that will be taking place this week. So I think you'll want to tune in every single day. But our third article comes from Michael McKenna. He is an individual that served in the White House. He was actually the deputy director of the Office of Legislative Affairs. And he's asking a very good question. And you should not be seen as not patriotic or anti-military or anti-Biden administration by asking it, because it's a good question. Why are we rushing to defend Ukraine? He says no one has yet explained what America's interest is. He says the military-industrial complex and its clients sprinkled throughout both political parties, by the way, this is not partisan, you have Democrats and Republicans talking about this, have decided that the next place we need to go and kill people, or at least sell weapons, is Ukraine. And so he reminds us that there's no way nice to say this, but Ukraine as a nation state is relatively new. He says in the 350 years since the Eternal Peace Treaty, that's actually what the name of it was signed in 1686, Ukraine has either been a vassal state or a province of Russia. Ukraine has been independent only since 1991, and that independence happened only as a consequence of the United States and its allies winning the Cold War. Those of us old enough to remember what that is the case. And so he points out a little bit later in the article that you have, of course, President Biden and his party, but also as what he calls it, a sizable chunk of the pre-Trump Republican Party who have been, in a sense, watching what he calls the slow motion invasion of our own southern border for more than 50 years. And yet now we see that hardly anything has happened in our southern border. But now all of a sudden there's this fixation on Ukraine. And he says it's kind of odd because we're under no legal or moral obligation to protect Ukraine, nor do we have any treaty obligations to Ukraine. No one, he says, has explained what the American interest is at risk in Ukraine, nor has anyone explained why American lives or property should be put at risk in the event of a Russian invasion into one of its former provinces. And he reminds us this is not necessarily to take all of this as no major issue, but he says there are many border disputes taking place right now. Maybe they don't involve the military. Some do. He says there are border disputes, for example, in Sudan, India, Gibraltar. There's, of course, a 100-year-old border dispute in Ireland, and, of course, they have never felt like that was a justification for it at all. And he also wonders whether or not Russia poses a material threat to the United States. Because, again, Russia has a GDP of less than $2 trillion, which means its economy is smaller than Canada's. Matter of fact, it's smaller than the state of Texas, but that's another point. So there's a good question about why are we rushing to defend Ukraine? Well, let's hear from some of the voices here that have been talking about this. Representative Michael McCall has been with us before. He was a representative from the state of Texas. He was on Face the Nation the other day, in which he was actually arguing that maybe because we seem weak and there is not deterrence, that maybe is one of the reasons why some of this is taking place. His direct quote, this again, Representative Michael McCall, "From Afghanistan forward, we have sent a message to our adversaries that we're projecting weakness, not strength." He went on to say that one thing Ronald Reagan talked about, peace through strength, going back to Chamberlain and Hitler, if we're projecting weakness, it only invites aggression. Historically, you know that. I talked to the administration. I want to stop this from happening. I'm very concerned about the aggression that I'm seeing, he says. I think this has been a passive deterrence, he talks about. I don't see Putin changing his course of action. It's getting very aggressive. The noose is tightening around Ukraine. Went on a little bit later to say time is of the essence. I'm working on a bill I've introduced to get an assistance package of lethal aid to Ukraine. That's important. But what's also important is the message of deterrence. We need joint exercises in Poland, the Baltic states, Romania, Bulgaria to show Putin that we're serious. If you look at your map, I imagine most of you would have trouble finding Ukraine on a map. You'd recognize Romania and Bulgaria to the west. But those are places where, because they are part of NATO and because we have relationships with them, we can do that. But then goes on to point out something we have said before. He's convinced that this issue involves a lot more than Ukraine. He says it's about China. It's about President Xi Jinping and Taiwan. It's about the Ayatollah and the bomb. It's about North Korea that just fired off 2 missiles, hypersonic weapons. I think this has broader global implications. By the way, I agree. Just not sure we need to necessarily deploy troops or even more weapons. But nevertheless, the Minister of Defense in Ukraine says he has received the second consignment of weapons from the United States, part of about $200 million worth of weapons that we have sent over there, or to put it in another way, about 90 tons of lethal security assistance that is actually dropped there. And what I thought was so interesting is Rick Grinnell. You might remember he is an individual that was the former ambassador to Germany, actually goes on to say that there is a sense in which we sort of wonder if we have to do it by going alone, because he says we don't have good choices. The reality is the leaders of Russia and China and other places smell weakness. He says, I can tell you from experience, I've been at the State Department for 11 years. The individuals who are in charge of our embassy in Ukraine right now are not making decisions on their own. They're going back and organizing with the Assistant Secretary of State for Europe, as well as trying to work with the Germans, which leads, interestingly enough, to my last piece before we take a break and take some phone calls, and that is Tom Rogan has posted a very good piece, and he has worked in this area as well. And he points out that we've always assumed that Germany would be a reliable American ally. But he asks the question, is Germany a reliable American ally now? And the answer is 9. German for no. He says, if anything, what we see now is we are facing 2 very consequential security threats, and China and Russia are actually the ones posing it. But Germany, he says, is no longer a credible ally. Why is that? For Germany, cheap gas, car imports to China and keeping Mr. Putin calm seem to be more important than any kind of allied democratic solidarity. Ukraine's fate will convey on Germany a heavy burden of responsibility. Right now, Germany has not allowed and has decided not to supply Ukraine with any weapons. It's actively preventing Estonia from doing so. And when Britain was trying to actually airlift anti-tank weapons to Ukraine, here's the interesting thing, they actually flew their flights around German airspace. The most direct between Britain and Ukraine would be Germany, but they took detours around Germany as well. So if you're expecting the Germans to stand up with you and to be part of your allies against Russia, don't think that's going to happen either. A lot of facts and figures that maybe you haven't heard, and we tried to bring those to you today here on Point of View. Come back from the break. Let's open up the phones. Get your comments. 1-800-351-1212. Love to hear your comments, and we'll be back right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Let's go out to Texas first. KBJS. John, what would you like to add to our conversation today?
Hi, Kerby. Well, I remember Rudy Giuliani pointing out that Ukraine was one of the money laundering hotspots that a lot of billions of dollars were funneled through. So I could see one reason why Joe Biden wouldn't want that information coming out. and would want us involved in some way. That's one thing that might be on their minds.
Well, and
Imagine.
Yeah, and of course, just the connection, Hunter Biden and all the rest, and of course, the fact that Ukraine has always been a place where the United States has wanted to maybe push a little further against the former Soviet Union by bringing in some of those countries that were part of the, if you will, satellite countries of the Soviet Union, and so there's always been a push to get Ukraine to be part of NATO, which would provide more transparency and clarity and a variety of other things. Plus, it would also, from a geostrategic kind of point of view, would be helpful to the West and detrimental to Russia as well. So that is certainly the case.
And I can also imagine that there's going to be a lot of paper burning in a lot of those major banks.
Very good. I have a little trouble hearing you there, but again, one of the issues that we're going to be watching is the issue of Ukraine. I know Edward in Arizona wanted to talk about the testimonies today. I'll just mention those in passing. We'll probably get to it later in the week, where they were holding a whole discussion, Senator Ron Johnson, about the issue of COVID-19, the vaccines, and the rest. Matter of fact, over the weekend, you had what has been described by the press as an anti-vax rally, and yet I went back and looked at some of the facts, including an individual, too, we've interviewed on this program, and they were saying, look, we're not necessarily against vaccines. We are against the mandates, and I think you can make a distinction, but those distinctions sometimes are lost by the people doing some of the press. But just before we run out of time, I just thought there are some matters to pray about, and one obvious one is to pray for our leaders, that we do not stumble into another military disaster, but also would encourage you to pray for the families who are associated with Ukraine, because Kiev, Ukraine, is where we have our embassy. Now it's called Kryv, as how they want to be pronounced, but I'll just use the old pronunciation, if you will. And the other day, a senior State Department official, while a lot of us were watching football games, said this. He says, first, as you know, we've authorized the departure of some U.S. government employees, while we have ordered the departure of all family members of U.S. government employees at our embassy in Kiev. The State Department has also elevated our travel advisory for Ukraine to level 4. Do not travel due to the increased threat of Russian military action. I would also note that the travel advisory was already at level 4, but nevertheless, these decisions are made out of an abundance of caution due to continued Russian efforts to destabilize the country and undermine the security of Ukrainian citizens and others visiting or residing in Ukraine. We have no higher priority than the safety and security of U.S. citizens, and this includes our U.S. government personnel and their dependents and the security of our facilities overseas. If you're counting, this is now the second time in basically 6 months we're evacuating an embassy where there is a threat at the border. Now, again, he went on to say, why did we make this decision? We believe that Russian invasion is imminent. It's certainly a possibility. He raised it as a question, but it sounded like it was a statement rather than a question. We'll leave it at that. As President Biden has said, military action by Russia could come at any time. The United States government will not be in a position to evacuate U.S. citizens in such a contingency. Don't you love that line? So U.S. citizens currently present in Ukraine should plan accordingly, including by availing themselves of commercial options should they choose to leave the country. Wouldn't you like to work for the State Department right now? You're in the Ukraine, and we say, we're really not in a position to evacuate you, so we hope you can find a flight out of Ukraine. Sleep well, America. And if you want to understand what could be a developing conflict, digging further into some of the information, Ukraine has either the second or the third largest military in Europe. So you're, in a sense, recognizing that even though the largest military is Russia at their border, Ukraine really indeed has some very significant military, which is why I'm going to make another prediction. So we'll crawl it out on a limb, and you can record it, and then we can make fun of me later on. I'm going to predict that maybe what will precede the possible invasion of Ukraine will be a cyber attack. Why do I say that? Because Russia has deployed that once before in their conflict in Georgia, and certainly a cyber attack could, first of all, knock out some of the military. It certainly could very quickly knock out a life for the Ukrainians, because if the power goes out, guess what? Natural gas is no longer flowing to heat the homes. Bank systems close down. ATMs are not working. They could even maybe close down the air traffic control system, the rail system. You can begin to think about what might indeed happen. So if I have not given you enough reason to pray, well, I certainly have failed, because I am very concerned about not only what is happening to American personnel there, but whether or not we stumble into another potential disaster. Just before we wind down for today, let me mention that our first article is one that came from our editors of National Review, in which they were pointing out that this whole election law circus that we talked about last week really was a circus, because the argument being made by Chuck Schumer is that the American elections are a rigged game. One that they won, by the way. Or, again, the comment by the president that the elections could be considered illegitimate. And yet, if you dig further into this article, you recognize very quickly that, first of all, there was a threat to get rid of the filibuster by individuals that have been supportive of the filibuster. Senator Joe Biden, as well as almost all the Democratic caucus just a few years ago, actually signed on to support the filibuster, because then they were fearful of what maybe Donald Trump might do. Then now they launched a kamikaze attack to get rid of the filibuster, when just the other day, in case you haven't been keeping track, they used the filibuster to block a bill that had 55 votes that would support sanctions on Russia for what they did with their pipeline with Germany. And yet, interestingly enough, near the end of the article, it reminds us that both of these bills were actually designed as partisan messaging bills, not governing agendas. They were simply an attempt to show their liberal base that we support you, with no expectation that they would actually get passed. But when the Build Back Better Act didn't go anywhere, they kind of refocused and said, well, maybe we can at least try to see if we can pass these particular bills, which I would predict would be declared unconstitutional by a Supreme Court, to actually use that to, first of all, get rid of the filibuster, and then push those two bills through and signed by President Biden. Of course, the problem was you had people like Senator Kyrsten Sinema, a Democrat from Arizona, another one, Joe Biden, a Democrat from West Virginia, as well as a couple others that probably would have voted as well against the idea of removing the filibuster if they were forced to do so, but fortunately didn't have to actually walk the plank, although some did, and that will affect the future elections on that issue. So a couple of articles for you to read, and let me again mention that tomorrow we'll be hearing from our good friend Jim Dennison on his new book, David Curry with Open Doors, and Dave Sterrett on Jesus Conversations. I think you'll enjoy all the conversations that will be taking place tomorrow here on Point of View. I want to thank Andrew for his help pulling together our articles, and as an engineer, for our producer Steve. We look forward to seeing you tomorrow right here on Point of View.
Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas recently said, "The Declaration of Independence has weathered every storm for 245 years. It birthed a great nation. It abolished the sin of slavery, and it endeavored to address its effects. While we have failed the Declaration time and again, and the ideals of the Declaration time and again, I know of no time," said Thomas, "when the ideals have failed us." While some see our founding as fatally flawed and promote ideas that have failed every time they've been tried, at Point of View, like Justice Thomas, we still believe in America's ideals. And if you do too, make a difference today. Join the Truth Team as we promote the unchanging truth that gave us liberty and prosperity. Visit pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151. The original Americans responded to the call. Will you? Pointofview.net/team and 1-800-347-5151. 5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.